Inside a live congressional hearing broadcast to millions, Representative Jasmine Crockett was blindsided when Kash Patel called her a domestic threat to national security before she had even said a word. But what began as a calculated smear turned into a political firestorm when Crockett calmly presented undeniable evidence. The hearing spiraled into chaos, and the balance of power began to shift. Now the question isn't if Patel went too far, but how hard he's about to fall. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The CBS News studio was a steel trap of lights and lenses, every inch designed to control the message. But what happened next, no producer could contain. Tonight's special live broadcast on national security had drawn high-profile names, former officials, journalists, and members of Congress alike. But none more polarizing than Kash Patel, seated center stage beneath the shimmering blue lights, his fingers steepled, his voice sharpened to surgical precision. The moderator was barely halfway through a question when Patel interrupted, leaning toward the camera like a man with nothing left to lose. "We've been hunting threats abroad for 20 years, he said coldly, but no one wants to admit the real danger is already inside our borders. And some of them," he turned his gaze toward the gallery, "are elected officials." A half-second of confused silence. Then with a venom-laced calm, he dropped the bomb. "Jasmine Crockett, yes, that one, has done more to undermine national unity than any foreign agent I've seen. She's not just misinformed. She's a domestic threat hiding behind a congressional badge." Gas shot across the room like a chain reaction. On the studio floor, jaws dropped, some in disbelief, others in satisfaction. The camera operators exchanged panicked glances, unsure whether to cut away or zoom in. The audience, stunned into stillness, turned as one toward the fifth row where Jasmine Crockett sat. Rigid, unmiked, blindsided. She had come here as an observer, not a target. Her hands, folded calmly just moments ago, were now clenched around the edge of her chair. Her name had not been mentioned in the briefing. There was no heads up, no off-air warning. And yet here she was, being painted as an enemy of the state in front of millions, without a voice, without a rebuttal, and without a script. One could almost hear the blood drain from her face before the fire returned to her eyes. This wasn't a policy debate. It was a public ambush. And the worst part? The network let it happen. The rules of engagement had been shattered. The moment wasn't just televised, it was weaponized. And as the audience whispered and the cameras stayed locked on her frozen posture, Jasmine Crockett didn't just feel humiliated. She felt hunted. She could sense it now, clear as the heat of stage lights on her skin. This wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a reckless outburst. It was a hit. And somewhere, far from the studio's perfect soundstage, the real conversation had already happened. Behind closed doors in dark rooms, over polished tables where power traded favors and reputations were currency. The shot fired tonight had been loaded days ago. All that remained was to find out who pulled the trigger and who had handed them the gun. 2 days before the broadcast, a quiet storm had already begun to gather, hidden from public view, buried beneath layers of encryption, privilege, and plausible deniability. It came to light only because a junior systems engineer at Open Access, an independent nonprofit tracking covert influence on Capitol Hill, flagged an unusual digital trail in their daily scan, a bounce-back PDF file from a high-ranking defense consulting domain, forwarded anonymously to a dead-drop inbox. At first glance, it looked like internal scheduling material, but by line 3, the subject matter had shifted from mundane logistics to something unmistakably sinister. The document bore the heading, NS Risk Brief, Potomac Exec Dinner, January 19th. The tone was clinical, matter-of-fact, stripped of emotion, but heavy with calculation. Beneath a list of attendees, several of whom had ties to billion-dollar procurement contracts, was a highlighted bullet point that turned everything into a political powder keg. Targeting Crockett on air can offset negative press and reduce exposure, reclassified doc inquiry. Those words flat on the page felt like a punch in the ribs to the analyst reading them. They were followed by another line, even colder. If optics shift, support to neutralize OIG review will be reactivated via Hill intermediaries. To any outsider, it might sound like vague legalese, but to anyone familiar with the inner workings of DC, the meaning was unmistakable. If Kash Patel could destroy Jasmine Crockett's credibility on live television, the powerful men in that room would bury the investigation against him. In plain language, character assassination in exchange for erasure. The minutes were concise but brutal in their implications. Patel had not only been present, he had volunteered. His quote was recorded verbatim in a side note. "If I can make her the villain, then I stop being the story." That wasn't strategy. That was sacrifice. A deliberate choice to throw a sitting congresswoman into the fire. Not for ideology, not for policy, but for self-preservation. No one in the room had pushed back. No one had asked what it might do to her safety, her career, her family, her reputation. The men around that table, former Pentagon officials, PR advisors, intelligence consultants, had simply nodded. One lobbyist toasted the idea with his bourbon. Another added a suggestion. "Go for optics. Make her look angry. That'll do half the job for you." These weren't fringe operators. These were architects of America's war budgets, designers of policy headlines, the very people who called journalists assets in scandals, timing issues. For them, this wasn't personal, it was arithmetic. Crockett had introduced a bill demanding increased transparency around domestic surveillance programs that some of these same men had profited from. She had asked too many questions. Now she had to be turned into an answer. And Kash Patel? He didn't need convincing. He saw an opportunity not just to save himself, but to re-enter the political bloodstream as a warrior taking down a threat from within. He agreed, without hesitation. According to the notes, he'd even pushed the timeline forward himself. The language was chilling in its calmness, almost rehearsed. "If I can make her the villain, then I stop being the story." There it was. The logic of predators dressed in patriotism. In a room full of men whose reputations depended on public amnesia, Crockett had become inconvenient. And in DC, inconvenient is just one step from disposable. And as the last line of that meeting memo echoed in the silence, "If I can make her the villain, then I stop being the story," it became clear. This wasn't politics. It was premeditated destruction. They didn't want a debate. They wanted a takedown. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just on someone's radar. She was in their crosshairs. And they weren't aiming to wound. They were aiming to erase. The call came in just after 1:17 a.m. A single buzz on the encrypted phone line Jasmine's staff rarely used outside of classified briefings or emergencies. Tasha, her most trusted aide and a former digital forensic specialist with Homeland Security, had just dozed off when the alert vibrated violently against the hotel nightstand. She sat up instantly, pulse quickening. The number was untraceable. No location, no digital signature. Just blank space, a breath. Then a voice. Distorted, hushed, male. Not robotic, but altered. "You don't know me," the voice began, "but someone's setting her up. The Patel segment tomorrow, it's not a panel. It's an ambush. They're planning to name her, discredit her, and bury her under live optics. Tell her to pull out or be ready." Then nothing. No repetition, no callback. The line went dead as if it had never rung at all. Tasha stared at the screen, the words bouncing in her mind like static that wouldn't clear. It didn't feel like a prank. It felt precise, measured, like someone on the inside had reached their breaking point. She ran a quick trace on the call. Dead end. Then she reached for the secure folder beside her bed, already labeled in Crockett's handwriting, "Contingencies, Media, Hostile Exposure." This wasn't their first warning, but it was their first direct threat tied to a specific name, a specific time. Within minutes, she was down the hallway of the Capitol Regency Hotel, heart pounding, adrenaline rising, knocking twice in the pre-agreed rhythm. Short, long, short. Crockett answered instantly, fully dressed, her eyes sharp but unreadable. "I was up," she said simply, as if she'd felt the air shift too. Tasha didn't waste time. She recited the warning exactly as she'd heard it, every syllable intact, like reading a death sentence off a page. She expected outrage, maybe fear, maybe retreat. But Jasmine Crockett's face didn't move, not even a twitch. Instead, her voice came low, firm, like stone scraping steel. They want a stage. Fine, she said. Then we give them a reckoning. She turned to the far end of the suite, past the minibar and the morning briefing folders, and opened a reinforced black case bolted inside her travel bag. From it, she pulled out a small matte black USB drive, sealed, unmarked, military grade. They think I'm walking in empty-handed, she murmured, eyes not leaving the drive. Let them. The drive had been sitting untouched for weeks, locked away not for lack of courage, but for discipline. It was never meant to be used in a live broadcast. It was insurance. Inside were documents from a confidential IG sub-investigation, never released to the public. Metadata logs, email chains, whistleblower memos, and 2 internal memos implicating Patel directly in the unauthorized modification of classified material workflows. The evidence wasn't circumstantial. It was names, dates, IP addresses, meticulously detailed and cross-referenced by a sympathetic staffer within the Office of the Inspector General. That staffer had handed it off weeks ago, quietly, through encrypted flash, urging, "Only use this if they try to break you publicly." Crockett hadn't wanted to believe she'd need it, but now she saw it clearly. They weren't trying to defeat her in policy. They were trying to destroy her in perception. Her hand curled around the drive like a fuse waiting to be lit. There would be fallout. She knew it. Blowback, headlines, retaliation, maybe even investigations of her own. But the line had been crossed. They had chosen deception as a weapon, spectacle as a shield. And now she would counter with the one thing they feared most: receipts they couldn't spin and truth they couldn't bury. This wasn't just survival. This was war. By the time morning broke over Washington, the die had already been cast. Jasmine Crockett wasn't walking into a debate. She was walking into a battlefield, mic'd and lit, with every camera prepped to catch her stumble. But what they didn't know, what they never saw coming, was that she hadn't come to play defense. She had come to detonate silence. The studio atmosphere felt almost sterile at first, bright, clinical, tightly controlled. But that illusion cracked the moment Kash Patel leaned forward, seizing the floor with practiced aggression. The questions had barely warmed the room before he made her the target. "Let's not pretend Congresswoman Crockett is some neutral observer in this," he began, his tone already thick with contempt. "This is the same person who's built her brand on division, a professional agitator, a race baiter. She doesn't seek solutions. She manufactures outrage." The words weren't analysis, they were ammunition, and each one landed with calculated venom. He wasn't addressing her. He was indicting her to the nation. For a moment, even the moderator hesitated, caught between journalistic duty and the gravitational pull of Patel's performance. Then came the pivot, sharp and deliberate. "Let's talk about Atlanta," Patel continued, his voice growing louder, his eyes narrowing like a man tightening the scope. "The protests, the property damage, the rhetoric, it all traces back to groups she's aligned with. Groups she's funded, promoted, praised. Groups that do more to fracture America than any foreign threat." His hand hovered over the table, fingers slicing the air with each accusation. His voice no longer concealed the intent, it reveled in it. The studio's tension thickened. There was no longer a conversation happening. This was political theater turned trial by ambush. And Jasmine Crockett, she remained motionless. She didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. Not even once. She sat with her back straight, chin high, gaze locked on Patel like a witness memorizing every move of a man who had already made a mistake. Her silence wasn't passivity. It was precision. It was the silence of someone who understood what they were trying to do and knew exactly how not to give it to them. Because Patel wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking at her, speaking over her, hoping that if he shouted enough, if he painted her into a corner fast enough, she'd snap. But she didn't. Twice the moderator tried to redirect. Twice Patel pressed forward, his voice rising. "She refused to denounce violent tactics," he declared, pointing toward her like an accuser in a courtroom. And then, on the third interruption, he made one mistake too many. He smirked, and he waved her off. That's when she moved. Without raising her voice, without making a show of it, Jasmine reached calmly into the inner lining of her blazer. The motion was deliberate, smooth, rehearsed not out of vanity, but necessity. Her hand emerged with a small, matte black USB drive, unmarked, cold, exact. She held it for just a moment, letting the light catch the steel glint before setting it gently on the glass table. The sound it made was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the silence that followed was not. It was immediate and total. Patel stopped mid-gesture. The moderator's eyes flicked downward. The audience collectively held its breath. They didn't know what was on it, but they knew, instinctively, absolutely, that this wasn't symbolic. This wasn't a bluff. This was a warning. "They think I'm walking in empty-handed," she murmured earlier that morning. "Let them." Now they knew. She hadn't come to take hits. She'd come to change the rules. And without saying a single word, she had just reminded the entire country that silence can be louder than any accusation, when it's holding the truth in the palm of its hand. The moment the USB touched the glass table, the room shifted. The air changed. Whatever performance Kash Patel thought he was giving, it was over. He had been playing chess with a mirror. And now, with the entire nation watching, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just holding receipts. She was about to make them undeniable. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush. She didn't need to. Her presence now filled the entire stage, not with noise, but with something more dangerous: truth, weaponized through restraint. She passed the USB to the production technician without looking away from Patel, her tone even and deliberate. "Cue Exhibit A," she said, every syllable like a loaded switch being flipped. The screen behind them came alive with the slow, haunting flicker of surveillance audio. The static cleared. The first voice was unmistakable. Not the polished tones Kash Patel used for CNN soundbites, but the quieter off-guard version, the one that only showed up in rooms where cameras weren't supposed to follow. "If I can make her the villain, then I stop being the story." The words hit the room like a gunshot. There was no noise, just a collective inhale. Viewers at home leaned forward. The audience in the studio froze mid-blink. Even Patel seemed to stop breathing. Crockett let the moment settle, not as drama, but as evidence. She looked toward him, not to challenge, but to confirm. "That's your voice, Mr. Patel," she said with perfect stillness. "From a private meeting at the Potomac Executive Club, 48 hours before this segment was scheduled. This is not a political disagreement. It's a premeditated smear, arranged in exchange for influence." Before Patel could move, before he could defend or even deflect, the screen changed again. This time, documents, government documents, side by side. The left column bore the header of the Office of the Inspector General, original draft, preliminary report, January 7th. The right column was nearly identical, until it wasn't. Modified draft, January 9th, sent from an external IP. The changes were highlighted in color. Where the original said deliberate breach of classified handling protocol, the revised version read procedural discrepancy. Where it had said unauthorized disclosures, the new version softened it to unconfirmed third-party exposure. Small changes in words, massive changes in meaning. In the bottom right corner of the screen, the metadata was displayed: username, timestamp, and digital signature. Kash Patel, clear, director, undeniable. "This is a sanitized report," Crockett said, her voice unwavering. "These are your track changes. You didn't just dispute the findings, you rewrote them." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The documents were speaking louder than any outrage could, and they were doing what Patel had tried to avoid at all costs, putting him under the microscope. Then came the final blow. Slide 3, an internal email chain. Top line redacted for whistleblower security. Subject line, narrative prep, leak strategy. The body of the email scrolled slowly down the screen like an indictment in motion. Planting the narrative before the hearing gives us control. Frame it as partisan, push blame upward, neutralize Crockett before the next oversight vote. The air thickened. Crockett let it hang in silence for 5 seconds, long enough for the words to sear into memory. Then, in a tone so calm it cut deeper than fury, she said, "This isn't oversight. This isn't policy. This is coordinated disinformation. In a functioning democracy, this isn't just unethical, it's a threat to every voter who believes in truth. Across the table, Patel sat motionless. His mouth was slightly open, his expression slack, caught between disbelief and panic. The lights made his skin appear waxy, drained of all previous color. The audience didn't move. No applause, no protest. Just a stunned, electric stillness. No one had expected it to go this far. No one had imagined she would come this prepared. And now, in front of millions, the roles had reversed completely. The prosecutor had become the defendant. The trap setter was the one now cornered. And Jasmine Crockett? She hadn't even raised her voice. All she did was show the truth and let the silence do the rest. What had started as a televised confrontation had now mutated into something far more dangerous. No longer a war of words, but a live leak of classified corruption. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed a political betrayal, she had accidentally cracked open the lid on a much deeper, darker wound. And somewhere beyond the stage lights and studio cameras, the consequences were already spreading. In the third row, lit only by the cold reflection of her laptop screen, veteran national security journalist Rachel Kim stopped typing. Her hands hovered above the keyboard, stiffening as her eyes locked onto a flickering line of text in the corner of the studio monitor. At first it meant nothing. A file hash code, a long string of alphanumeric characters, seemingly random, easily overlooked by everyone in the room except her. But Rachel had seen it before. Not on the internet, not in the press. She had seen it printed in bold red ink on a classified briefing packet handed to her under closed doors at the Hoover Building. It was part of an FBI intelligence bulletin about a sensitive ongoing breach, Code X4152, regarding a series of internal documents suspected to have been deliberately leaked to a foreign policy lobbyist with back-channel ties abroad. That hash code was the unique digital signature attached to one of the files in that case. It was supposed to be locked down. Instead, it was now glowing on a 10-foot screen in front of a live studio audience, and millions watching from home. Rachel's heart pounded against her ribcage. She didn't write a note. She didn't reach for her editor. She reached for her encrypted phone. No hesitation, no delay. She typed a single message to her classified contact at Justice. "Are you watching this?" And then she waited. Not for confirmation, but for the world to change. Less than 60 seconds later, inside the DOJ's Cyber Operations Center in Quantico, a system alarm chirped to life. A red alert protocol tagged the broadcast segment as a live match against protected metadata in the classified registry. At first, it was flagged as a low-level anomaly, a false positive, perhaps a mirrored file name. But then the analysts stepped in. They cross-checked the source code, digital imprint, access logs, and origin signature. No errors. No mistaking it. Jasmine Crockett had just displayed, without realizing, a document that matched the FBI's active counterintelligence file under restricted access. Tier 4. The file's contents weren't public, weren't supposed to exist in any USB, and now they were being dissected live on national television. The supervisor on shift didn't wait for a protocol review. She called it in directly to the Deputy Attorney General's National Broadcast Monitoring Desk. Within 3 minutes, the Department of Homeland Security's secure relay systems had locked onto the signal and rerouted the feed to internal servers. Not the network feed, but a clean, delay-free, forensic-level transmission from a DHS satellite node. It was no longer about optics. It was about exposure. The Department of Justice had now officially entered the studio. Not physically, not yet, but through every second of that feed. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman with documents anymore. She had, unknowingly, crossed into a live federal intelligence incident. For the agents now watching, the implications were staggering. How did she get the file? Who gave it to her? And more urgently, what else was in that USB? The protocol was clear. Observe, log, assess threat level, and prepare for rapid contact. Because whether she knew it or not, Crockett had just become both witness and whistleblower in a breach that could stretch beyond the walls of that studio, beyond Kash Patel, beyond even the hearing room. It could reach foreign capitals, intelligence networks, and hidden deals no one had meant to bring to light. And it had all started with one sentence. now etched into memory. Are you watching this? What had started as spectacle had crossed into scandal, and then again into something even more volatile. Exposure without precedent. The studio was no longer just a stage. It was a battlefield of credibility, consequence, and something no one could control. But Crockett wasn't finished. There was still one card left in her hand, and when she played it, no one would be able to look away. The moderator shifted in his chair. You could see it, subtle, but there. A flicker of unease in his posture, the kind that creeps in when a live broadcast stops following its script. With an apologetic tone sharpened by backstage pressure, he leaned toward Crockett. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, carefully weighing every word, you've introduced highly sensitive material, made serious allegations, and challenged the integrity of a former federal official. Some viewers and some members of this audience are asking, are you running a smear campaign? It was a soft accusation wrapped in a question, but it carried the full weight of a national audience waiting for her to stumble. The tension in the room surged. For a beat, she said nothing. But Crockett didn't blink. Her eyes didn't drift. Her hands didn't move. It was the stillness of someone who knew exactly where the truth lived and was about to make the whole country look it in the face. I'm not smearing anyone, she said, her voice as clear as steel drawn from a sheath. I'm stripping the gloss from the face of the truth. It was the kind of answer that wasn't designed to deflect, but to cut. Not for effect, but for clarity. She reached to her right, picked up the slim, government-issued tablet, and tapped the screen with her index finger. Then with a calm signal to the booth, she said, put this on the screen. Now. The wall behind them lit up instantly, and what it showed wasn't theory or conjecture. It was a scanned document stamped confidential. Department of Defense, internal use only. The header read, Internal Realignment, IG Oversight Division. It bore a full date, staff routing path, and digital authentication. Beneath that, in sharp black text, effective immediately, lead analyst Keller will be reassigned from data integrity review to administrative liaison, pending further notice. The timing wasn't a coincidence. The memo was dated 4 days after the original draft of the IG report citing Patel's violations had been circulated internally. Crockett stood her ground, eyes not on the audience but on the document, as if willing them to read what no one had wanted to say aloud. That's James Keller, she said quietly but firmly. The original investigator who flagged the discrepancies in Patel's handling of classified protocol. This order came directly from Patel's office, not because Keller made an error, but because he told the truth. Her voice dropped just slightly, not for dramatic effect, but to draw the audience closer. This wasn't oversight, it was obstruction. You didn't just edit a report, you tried to erase the man who wrote it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The weight of her words wasn't in the volume, it was in the evidence. Patel's face remained turned slightly away from the screen, but his eyes were locked, wide and unblinking. The power dynamic had fully inverted, and across the studio, in living rooms, and on government monitors nationwide, everyone watching knew they had just witnessed the truth, stripped bare and standing on its own. For a moment, there was nothing left to say. Jasmine Crockett had laid bare the manipulation, the cover-up, the retaliation. But what no one realized, not the audience, not the panel, not even Crockett herself, was that truth had already rippled far beyond the walls of that studio. And justice, silent until now, had already begun to move. It began with a whisper behind the cameras, a quiet voice through a headset that sliced through the noise like a blade through silk. He's here. That's all the floor manager said. She didn't need to elaborate. The producer froze mid-cue. The lighting technician's hand hovered above his dimmer switch. Time didn't stop, but it slowed, every second suddenly carrying more weight than it was meant to. From the corridor, under the harsh white lights that lined the studio's service hallway, stepped a man in plain clothes. Black jeans, worn boots, and a crisp Department of Justice windbreaker zipped to the collar. He moved with quiet certainty. Not rushed, not loud, just steady, like a verdict that had taken its time, but could no longer be postponed. In his hand was a sealed envelope. No fanfare, no handcuffs. Just a folded piece of government paper that, in the right context, was more dangerous than a bullet. The floor director stammered something under his breath, then turned to the assistant director. "He says it's signed," he muttered, almost in disbelief. The DOJ staffer approached without breaking stride. "We're here for Mr. Patel. Service order. It's signed." His voice wasn't confrontational. It didn't need to be. It was the voice of someone who did this often, someone who no longer needed to raise their voice to be heard. The floor manager opened her mouth, ready to protest. To say, "This isn't the time, not while we're live, not like this." But she never spoke. The envelope in the agent's hand made every argument irrelevant. It carried weight that overruled scripts and shut down PR instincts. It was a message, but more than that. It was authority made physical. On the other side of the stage, Kash Patel was still talking. He didn't see the movement, didn't see the security team whispering in the shadows. He was locked into his monologue, trying to regain ground that had already been pulled out from beneath him by Crockett's evidence. His tone had lost its earlier swagger. Now it sounded more like someone reading lines off a crumbling page. He couldn't see the shift, but the audience could, and so could the cameras. The DOJ official didn't stop at the edge of the curtain. He crossed into the line of sight behind the panel table, where Patel's aide stood. Without a word, he handed the envelope directly to the aide, his expression unreadable. And then came the moment, the line that would be replayed across every screen in the country before midnight. "This is a summons to appear before the Office of Federal Oversight. Immediate compliance required," the agent said. "Charges pertain to obstruction and interference with an active federal investigation." It landed like a crack of thunder inside a soundproof room. For a split second, even the cameras seemed to hesitate. The air inside the studio changed, thickening, slowing, bending around the weight of what had just been said. The audience didn't gasp all at once. It happened in small waves, like ripples radiating from a dropped stone. A few people covered their mouths. A few leaned forward, not breathing. The panelists, once seated with polished confidence, now shifted uncomfortably, their chairs squeaking under the tension. Kash Patel turned slowly. He didn't need to ask what it was. The envelope was already trembling slightly in his aide's hand, like it wanted to speak for itself. Patel's expression hardened, not in defiance but in panic poorly disguised as poise. His fingers reached for the paper, touched it, then retracted. For one long second he didn't move. And then, quietly, almost numbly, he took it. His hand curled around the edge of the envelope, knuckles pale, lips pressed into a line so tight it seemed like a dam. His eyes scanned the front. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. He knew exactly what it was. What stunned him wasn't the fact that it came. It was when it came. On camera, mid-sentence. Before he could spin, before he could retreat behind closed doors or talking points. He had been cornered not in a back room, not in court, but in front of the country. The moderator looked stunned, caught between professional restraint and the raw astonishment of witnessing history in real time. He adjusted his mic, his throat visibly tightening as he addressed the viewers. "Well, we seem to have received an unexpected development here." He didn't elaborate. He couldn't. Anything more would have broken the fragile line between news and spectacle. But the moment had already crossed that threshold. There was no going back. Patel's mouth opened as if to respond. Perhaps a denial, a retort, a pivot. But no words came. Only breath. Sharp, unsteady. The kind of breath a man takes when he knows the room has turned, and there's no script that can save him now. Jasmine Crockett didn't smile. She didn't raise an eyebrow. She didn't look away. She simply remained still, watching the exact moment when power, unchecked for so long, finally ran out of room to hide. And she didn't have to say a word, because the envelope said everything. And in that historic, breathless instant, America watched the truth walk in, on foot, with a single piece of paper, and stop a lie dead in its tracks. And just like that, the illusion shattered. The polished image, the media-tested posture, the illusion of control, gone. All that remained now was a man with his back against a wall, holding an envelope that no spin doctor could rewrite. But power rarely surrenders quietly. And in the seconds that followed, Kash Patel did what men in cornered silence often do. He exploded. Patel slammed the envelope down on the glass tabletop so hard it rattled the moderator's water glass. His voice, once rehearsed and composed, erupted with raw fury, slicing through the stillness like shrapnel. "This is a damn setup," he barked, leaning forward, pointing, not at Crockett, not at the DOJ agent, but at the very idea of the moment itself. A political ambush dressed up as justice. The veins in his neck bulged. His tie had twisted sideways. Sweat began to bead at his temple, catching the studio lights in sharp glints. "This isn't about national security," he growled, practically shaking now. "This is a coordinated hit job by the far left, designed to humiliate me, to silence dissent, to send a message to anyone who dares challenge their agenda." No one on stage moved. The moderator sat frozen, his jaw clenched, caught between protocol and disbelief. The audience wasn't cheering. They weren't booing. They were stunned. Even Patel's supporters looked rattled, some glancing nervously around, others folding their arms tight across their chests. "You people," Patel continued, his fingers sweeping across the crowd like a blade, "you've turned the Department of Justice into your personal attack dog." His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from volume, emotion, and the knowledge that he wasn't winning anymore. "This isn't law. This isn't truth. This is revenge wrapped in a press release." And yet the envelope sat where he had slammed it, silent, undeniable, unbothered by rage. Its presence remained louder than his protest, because while Patel shouted, Crockett hadn't moved. And that, more than anything, was what unhinged him. His voice lingered like smoke, sharp, hot, but already beginning to dissipate. Kash Patel had erupted with fury, shouting about conspiracies, vengeance, and partisan ambushes. But behind the fire was something far more revealing: fear, not just of what had been shown, but of what could no longer be controlled. For a man so skilled at framing others, this was unfamiliar ground. And as the storm of his own creation raged around him, Jasmine Crockett stood perfectly still, unmoved, unreadable. Because she understood something Patel did not. The loudest voice in the room isn't always the most powerful. Sometimes it's the quiet one that delivers the final blow. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush to speak. She waited, long enough to let the silence reclaim the room from Patel's fury. Her eyes were locked onto him, not with rage, not even judgment, but with a calm so disarming it felt surgical. The kind of calm that doesn't shout over chaos, but slices right through it. "You called me a domestic threat," she said quietly, her voice low and steady, carrying farther than any scream could. "But it's your own documents, your own memos, your own redacted edits that show who's really undermining this country from the inside." She didn't raise her tone. She didn't lean forward. But the weight of what she said landed with the precision of a gavel in a courtroom. The truth didn't need to roar. It needed only to stand, unapologetic and still. Crockett let the words hang in the air, not because she needed to dramatize them, but because she knew the room needed time to feel their full gravity. And it did. Patel, just moments before swollen with fury, now sat speechless. His mouth was slightly open, as if his body hadn't yet caught up to what had just been said. He stared back at her, but it wasn't a stare of defiance. It was the look of a man realizing he had no line left to cross, because he was already on the other side. Crockett remained standing. She didn't move, didn't shift. Her posture told its own story. She had endured every loaded label, every attempt to discredit her credentials, her motives, her identity. But in this moment, none of that held power anymore. Not when the evidence bore his name. Not when the documents, the same ones Patel tried to erase, twist, or bury, were now casting light on every shadow he'd built his defense behind. And then the crowd responded. It wasn't instant. It came like a swell, slow, rising, unstoppable. 70% of the audience began to clap. Some stood. Some pounded their palms together, not just in approval, but with something more visceral: relief, validation, vindication. The kind of applause that doesn't just celebrate a person, but a moment long overdue. It was raw and unfiltered. People clapped with their whole bodies, like something heavy had been lifted from the room and they could finally breathe again. But not everyone applauded. 30% stayed seated, faces tight, arms crossed, some angry, some visibly confused. For them, the moment was more than uncomfortable. It was destabilizing. Their guy had just been dressed down by a woman he tried to discredit on live television, and not through insults or dramatics, but through cold, documented truth. That kind of defeat stings deeper because it's harder to dismiss. Still, they didn't leave. No one did. Not a single person looked away. Because what just happened was bigger than partisanship, bigger than narrative. It was something undeniable, and the room knew it. Crockett hadn't just turned the tables. She had flipped the script completely, without screaming, without personal attacks. She had walked through the fire carrying receipts and emerged without a single singed thread. And as the applause rang out and the silence settled behind it, Patel remained seated, the envelope still on the table in front of him, unopened, untouched. He looked down at it, then up at her, but she was already turning away, not in dismissal, but in closure, because the real statement had already been made, and it didn't need to be repeated. The room never returned to normal. Not after that. Not after the truth was spoken without apology, and the illusion of invincibility cracked open on live television. Patel never recovered his posture. He never opened the envelope. And Crockett? She didn't need to win the room. She'd already won the record. But while the lights dimmed and the credits rolled, what no one inside that studio yet realized was that the real eruption hadn't happened in there. It was happening everywhere else. By dawn, the sun hadn't even touched the Capitol dome before the headlines started landing like grenades. CNN. Congresswoman Crockett eviscerates Patel live. Then DOJ shows up. MSNBC. In 47 seconds, Jasmine Crockett changed the game, and possibly the law. Fox News. Explosive exchange, rocks hearing, subpoena sparks, political stunt debate. The New York Times, from oversight to overthrow. The moment truth took the floor. BBC World News. U.S. lawmakers' calm rebuke goes global after live DOJ summons. The footage played on a loop. Patel's face the moment he received the envelope. The sound of Crockett's words clear, surgical, and historic. Her silence while he raged. Her composure while he unraveled. Social media became a firestorm of reaction, stitching together every angle, every breath, every frame into political legend. But it wasn't the documents that went viral. It wasn't even the subpoena. It was the quote, delivered just minutes before the broadcast ended. As Patel fumbled through another failed deflection, Crockett had leaned forward once more, not for drama, but clarity, and said, "Want to question my qualifications? Make sure you're clean enough to sit across from me." It hit like a bullet dipped in truth. The room went still. Patel didn't respond. He couldn't. And by the time morning came, that line wasn't just a mic drop. It was a political doctrine. It made the front page of Politico before breakfast. It became a sticker on coffee mugs before lunch. And by nightfall, a muralist in downtown Atlanta had already painted the quote across an entire brick wall. Crockett's profile shadowed behind the words in muted blue and gold. Inside Capitol Hill, the response came even faster. By 8:30 a.m., Crockett's office had received 117 media requests, including full-hour sit-downs with Jake Tapper, Nicole Wallace, and, unbelievably, even Brett Baier. But it wasn't the media frenzy that marked the shift. It was what arrived next. A sealed invitation from the House Judiciary Committee, hand-delivered by the chief counsel's clerk, and offered to testify in a closed-door national security oversight session within 72 hours. No other freshman representative had received such a summons that year. It wasn't just respect, it was recognition of both her precision and her restraint. She hadn't just dismantled a seasoned former federal official in public. She had done it without leaking, without slandering, without breaking her oath. And then came the next knock, a confidential request from the Office of Bipartisan Oversight, an elite, rarely acknowledged task force that monitored federal classification abuses with equal seats for both parties. Crockett's name had been formally nominated by two senior members, one Democrat, one Republican, both of whom had watched the segment live from separate secure rooms. The message was short, formal, but its implication was seismic. We believe your conduct demonstrated the judgment, legal discipline, and constitutional clarity required to help restore trust in federal oversight. If you accept this nomination, further briefings will begin immediately. She stared at the paper for a long time, not because she was surprised, but because she understood exactly what it meant. Not a promotion, not a title, a responsibility, one earned not through rank, but through fire. Outside her office, the phones rang nonstop. Journalists, constituents, donors, even a few Republicans calling, not to argue, but to say they'd watched. They had questions, they wanted facts, and some surprisingly said thank you. But still, as the day churned forward, Crockett remained calm. She declined most interviews. She gave only one quote to the Washington Post when asked how she stayed so composed in the face of Patel's verbal assault and the sudden chaos that followed. She paused, then said, "If you know you're standing on the truth, you don't have to yell to be heard." That line got its own column, but it was her viral moment from the night before that stayed lit across every screen, etched into the country's collective political memory like scripture forged in fire. Want to question my qualifications? Make sure you're clean enough to sit across from me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was a mirror, and Patel had shattered against it. Even on Capitol Hill, known for its short memory and shifting loyalties, the quote lingered like a warning. And some who had once whispered doubts about her, too young, too outspoken, too blunt, now found themselves rethinking everything, because Crockett had done the one thing they all claimed to value but rarely practiced. She had told the truth without blinking and made it stick. In committee rooms, her name came up differently. No longer in "who is she" tones, but in "how did she do it" tones. A few staffers even began studying her hearing transcripts, noting how she built her rhythm. Legal framing first, then strategic pressure, then factual proof. The pattern was deliberate, relentless, and now effective enough to redefine how televised accountability could look. By the end of the day, Crockett had cleared her schedule. No grandstanding, no press conference. Just a quiet visit to the Library of Congress, where she requested a digital copy of every hearing transcript she'd participated in to date. She read through them in silence, annotating in the margins. Not because she needed the praise, but because she understood. Now the stakes were higher. Now every word mattered more than ever. The final image of the day wasn't on CNN. It wasn't on TWITTER. It was from a quiet hallway camera inside the Capitol. Jasmine Crockett, alone, walking out of the hearing room that had erupted the night before. The same room where she'd been called a threat. The same room where she'd stood, unshaken, and answered not with volume, but with evidence. And carved into the moment, immortalized by every outlet in America, were 12 words that turned political power on its head. Want to question my qualifications? Make sure you're clean enough to sit across from me. And for once, even Washington knew. There was nothing left to say. The next 24 hours were not quiet. If Crockett thought truth alone would end the noise, she was mistaken. The political machine doesn't bleed cleanly. It thrashes, it recalibrates. And now it had a new target, not Patel, but the woman who exposed him. The backlash didn't take long. By mid-morning, 3 right-wing super PACs launched coordinated campaigns labeling her a radical in pearls, painting her viral moment as pre-scripted theater. An anonymous source inside a conservative think tank called her dangerous, manipulative, and, most predictably, unqualified. An entire segment on the Ingram angle that evening was titled, "When Congress Becomes a Courtroom Circus." They didn't show the documents. They didn't air Patel's meltdown, but they replayed her quote on a loop, spliced between images of protesters, rising crime stats, and a stock market graph sliding red. Online, it was worse. Dozens of bot-fueled threads popped up overnight, many recycling debunked accusations from months prior, suggesting she had ties to anti-American groups, twisting her prior civil rights cases into proof she hated law enforcement. Her Wikipedia page was hacked 3 times. One troll account posted, "She talks like a prosecutor, but walks like an activist." Who does she really serve? The machine was angry, but not because she had lied, because she hadn't. Inside her office on the Hill, the energy was starkly different. Her staff moved quietly, efficiently, heads down. No high fives, no music. The moment wasn't being celebrated, it was being managed. There were folders to respond to, threat assessments to review. A senior aide had already received a soft inquiry from Capitol Police about temporary personal security enhancements. Another intern had printed out all the press coverage and highlighted every paragraph that mentioned classified documents, leak, or Patel. The stack was thick, but Crockett didn't touch it. Instead, she stood at her window, watching. Outside, the Capitol lawn looked the same as always. Staffers walking to appointments, tour groups murmuring, school kids snapping selfies on the steps. Life moved on, like truth had never shouted from inside these halls the night before. But something was different. She could feel it, not outside, but inside her own chest. That subtle tremor that comes when you realize you've said something that can't be unsaid, that you've become something that can't be unseen. And in Washington, that's when the real danger begins. At 2:10 p.m., she entered the secure committee room. It wasn't televised, no press, no tweets, no leaks. The bipartisan oversight group had called her for a confidential review. 5 senators, 3 representatives, all cleared for high-level briefings. No formal vote had been cast yet, but this was the final step before appointment. She didn't dress for show, navy suit, no makeup beyond the basics. Her legal pad had no speech, just bullet points. She took her seat, looked each person in the eye, and waited. The chairman, a Republican from Utah with 40 years in classified policy work, opened with something unexpected. "You could have leaked that file to the press," he said flatly, "could have dropped it anonymously and walked away clean. But you showed it on camera. And now half the country wants to crown you, and the other half wants to burn you." She nodded once. "That's about right." "So why?" he asked. Crockett didn't blink. "Because I was told to be quiet when it happened to me. And I swore if I ever saw it again, truth being buried to protect power, I'd call it out. No matter what it cost." There was silence. Then a voice from the far end of the table, a Democratic senator from Oregon, broke it. "You just answered the only question that mattered." The rest of the session lasted 34 minutes. It wasn't warm, it wasn't cold, it was measured. She was asked about the origin of the USB, her chain of custody, whether she understood the precedent, whether she was prepared to sit across from future intelligence officials who may have supported Patel's clearance pathway. She answered every question, not with spin, but with facts, not with charm, but with clarity. When she left the room, no one shook her hand. No one smiled, but one of the clerks slipped her a note on the way out. It read, "Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in D.C. is be honest and correct." That night, she didn't go on television. She didn't host a live stream, didn't tweet. She went home, made tea, and sat on her balcony alone. From her apartment, she could still see the top of the Capitol dome glowing in the dark, white, quiet, sterile. But behind that dome now was a reckoning she had forced into motion. She checked her phone once. Her quote had just passed 28 million impressions. "Want to question my qualifications? Make sure you're clean enough to sit across from me." It had been turned into a TikTok sound, a chant outside the courthouse in Detroit, a slogan on a protest banner in Louisville. Someone had even looped it over Kendrick Lamar's DNA. She wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. She did neither. Instead, she sat in the dark, finally letting the weight of it settle on her chest. Because behind the applause, the media, and the myth-making, she was tired. Not defeated, but tired in the way only truth-tellers get tired. Not from the fight itself, but from knowing the next one is already waiting around the corner. At 6:43 a.m. the next morning, her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "Saw the BBC. You didn't just survive. You walked through the fire and lit a match on the way out." She smiled for the first time in 24 hours. But she also knew fires draw attention, and not everyone watching comes with water. She had crossed a line, and even if justice was on her side, the system she just exposed would not go quietly. Still, she was ready, because when they called her unqualified, they forgot something. They assumed truth required permission, and Jasmine Crockett had just reminded the country it never did. In the hours that followed the storm, long after the last camera blinked off and the headlines began to cool, there was a different kind of silence, a deeper one. Not the kind laced with fear or uncertainty, but the kind that comes after a truth has finally been spoken aloud. The kind of silence that settles over a battlefield when the smoke has cleared and the dust has no more air to hang in. Jasmine Crockett sat alone on the edge of her couch, barefoot, still wearing the navy blazer she hadn't had time to change out of, her shoulders slightly hunched. Not in defeat, but in reflection. The adrenaline had burned off, the voices had faded, and what remained was something colder, heavier, but more enduring. The realization that standing up had worked, but it had also cost her something she hadn't yet named. Because justice, real justice, always comes at a cost. The public saw the victory. They saw the moment the quote dropped like a seismic shockwave. Want to question my qualifications? Make sure you're clean enough to sit across from me. They saw the applause, the subpoenas, the silence from her opponent. But what they didn't see, what they never see, was the weight a person carries after they tell the truth. After the room empties and the fight becomes personal. After the machine, battered and embarrassed, begins quietly sharpening its knives in the dark. That night, her inbox overflowed with both reverence and venom. Praise from civil rights groups, hate from anonymous accounts, veiled warnings from industry insiders who knew just how badly Washington punishes those who break the script. And then there were the whispers, staffers who advised her to lay low, tone it down, make friends again on the Hill. Not because she was wrong, but because she had been right too early, too completely and too publicly for the system's comfort. That's the lesson they never write in law books. The price of courage is loneliness. She didn't regret it, not for 1 second. But as she stared at the Capitol dome glowing in the distance, she understood something in her bones now, that it was one thing to call out injustice. It was another thing entirely to walk through the fire of it, knowing no one would hand you water. She thought about every time she had been told to wait her turn, to prove herself, to be less confrontational, more bipartisan, more polished, more grateful. The coded language of power, be quiet, be small, and maybe, just maybe, we'll let you stay in the room. But she didn't come to stay in the room. She came to flip the table, and that's why they feared her. Because she had no interest in being included if it meant being silenced. She had no desire to trade integrity for invitations. And most dangerous of all, she had proof. Proof that could not be debated. Proof that bore Patel's name and timestamp. And that's what turned her from a political nuisance into a national reckoning. Not her voice, but the receipts she brought with it. And so the lesson revealed itself, not just to her, but to the nation watching. That in a system obsessed with appearance, substance is its greatest threat. She didn't win because she outshouted her opponent. She won because she let the facts do the screaming. She didn't humiliate anyone. She simply held up the mirror, and in doing so, reminded every voter, every viewer, and every sitting member of Congress that truth doesn't need to be palatable to be necessary. It just needs to be undeniable. But here's the other part of the lesson. The one even heroes don't always see coming. Truth alone doesn't protect you. People do. And Crockett, for all her composure, all her preparation, knew she now stood at a crossroads. One path led to token status, invited to panels, featured in think pieces, celebrated in viral clips, but quietly isolated in the actual halls of power. The other path? It led straight into the fire again. No insulation, no certainty. Just the knowledge that if she didn't keep going, the next Jasmine wouldn't make it through the door. Because injustice doesn't die in one hearing. It morphs, it regroups, it waits. And what frightened her adversaries most wasn't what she had said on air. It was what she might say next. It was that she hadn't just burned one bridge, she had proven she knew how to build new ones out of the ashes. And so for every person who had ever been told they were too loud, too bold, too emotional, too unqualified, this was a reckoning, not just against Patel, not just against bureaucratic corruption, but against the very architecture of exclusion that had ruled Washington for generations. She was no longer just a congresswoman. She had become something else now, a symbol, a warning, and a blueprint. Because that's what truth tellers become when the lie they expose is big enough. They stop being individuals and start becoming proof that a different system is possible. And that's the most dangerous thing in the world to those who benefit from the old one. The real human lesson wasn't that Crockett had stood her ground. It was that every system designed to silence her had underestimated the one thing it couldn't discredit: evidence delivered by a woman who refused to flinch. And it was that refusal, more than any document, more than any quote, that cracked the dam. Because when she said, "Want to question my qualifications? Make sure you're clean enough to sit across from me," what she meant wasn't just for Patel. It was for every gatekeeper who ever mistook composure for permission. And in that one sentence, she didn't just defend herself. She gave every person watching a new definition of power: not dominance, not status, but clarity, anchored in truth, unmoved by fear. And that's how revolutions begin. Not with riots, with receipts, with someone standing still against the tide and saying, "No more." Revolutions don't start when the powerful speak louder. They begin when the silenced finally refuse to whisper. And Jasmine Crockett had done more than survive the storm. She had drawn a map through it. But a map means nothing if no one walks it. And now the question hung heavy in the air, pressing against the conscience of a watching nation. What will you do with what she exposed? If you've ever watched injustice unfold and felt powerless, this is your moment. If you've ever been told to sit down, wait your turn, or play by rules designed to keep you silent, this is your signal to rise. Jasmine Crockett didn't just fight for herself. She held a mirror up to a broken system and showed the rest of us that truth, when spoken boldly and backed by evidence, is more explosive than any weapon. But that truth can't live in one person alone. It needs a movement. It needs you. Because the forces she stood up to, they haven't gone quiet. They've gone underground, rebuilding, retaliating, ready to erase every receipt the moment we stop watching. And so, we can't stop. You don't need a title to take a stand. You don't need a podium to make noise. You need resolve. You need memory. You need to carry what she uncovered into every boardroom, classroom, courtroom, and ballot box. Share the clip. Quote her words. Hold leaders accountable when they try to gaslight their way through the facts. This isn't about party. This is about principle. About whether we will continue to allow power to protect itself by scapegoating those who dare to challenge it, or whether we'll draw the line and say, as she did, no more. Now is not the time for admiration. It is the time for action. Demand transparency. Demand oversight. Demand that truth is no longer buried under bureaucracy and political theater. Call your representatives. Ask where they stand on classified manipulation, on whistleblower protection, on political retaliation against truth tellers. And don't stop asking. Don't let them hide behind headlines. Make them answer, not just to the press, but to the people they claim to serve, because silence is no longer neutral, it's complicity. And if you've ever felt like your voice wouldn't matter, look again. One congresswoman, facing slander, sabotage, and a smear campaign designed in backrooms, stood alone. And because she did, the truth was heard around the world. Now it's your turn, your inbox, your camera, your feet, your voice. Make noise. Make change. Make it impossible for those in power to pretend they didn't see what we all saw. A woman armed with facts standing in a fire and refusing to burn. This isn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It's about all of us, and whether we're brave enough to follow her lead. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a packed national summit on civil rights, Jasmine Crockett and Candace Owens take the stage. But what begins as a debate explodes into a war for the soul of Black America. Candace calls the fight for justice a performance, but Jasmine fires back with a truth so raw it stops the room cold. As accusations fly and a buried scandal resurfaces on live screen, the crowd is forced to choose unity or surrender. Two women, one microphone, and a nation on edge. What happens when the queen of outrage is dethroned? By a truth so powerful it doesn't even need to shout. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the vaulted lights of the Philadelphia Civic Arena, tension dripped from the ceiling like sweat from a clenched fist. The stage had been transformed into something more than a platform. It was a battlefield wrapped in silk and steel, with the insignia of the Democratic National Committee hovering above like a seal of judgment. 12 major networks had their cameras trained on the two podiums in the center. The words "Live from the Civil Rights Policy Summit, the Great Divide" scrolled ominously across every screen in America. Backstage, technicians whispered like monks preparing for ritual, while armed security surveyed every movement with cold, rehearsed precision. Nearly 4,000 attendees filled the arena. Politicians, activists, donors, and skeptics, each one waiting for the moment when rhetoric would turn into revelation. This wasn't just another debate. This was the night when two Black American icons would step onto the same stage. A Jasmine Crockett, the progressive firebrand with scars to prove her fight, and Candace Owens, the conservative lightning rod who had made a career out of controversy. And somewhere in the haze of anticipation, the moderator leaned toward his producer and murmured off mic, "If one of them breaks tonight, it won't stop at this arena. It'll explode all the way to the White House." The spotlight slashed the darkness, revealing Jasmine Crockett as she stepped into view, composed but coiled like a spring. Her heels struck the floor with purpose, a rhythm of resolve. One side of the arena erupted in cheers, the other in cold, hostile silence. Jasmine didn't blink. She had walked through fire to get here, but this wasn't just another fight, it was her reflection, twisted. Across the stage, Candace Owens appeared with the confidence of someone convinced history had already chosen her. Their eyes met. The crowd held its breath. The cameras rolled. This wasn't a debate. This was a reckoning, and it was live. The silence between them didn't cool the air. It thickened it, coiling like smoke before fire, waiting for the first strike. Candace Owens stepped forward with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment far longer than the debate itself. Her voice was steady, deliberate, and so composed it became chilling. "Black Lives Matter isn't a movement," she said, each word clipped and calculated. "It's a business, a cash machine powered by guilt and tragedy." She didn't shout, didn't gesture. She simply let the sentence land and spread like oil across a wooden floor, waiting for a match. There was a pause, a collective breath held by the audience. Not because they agreed, but because many knew what had just happened. This wasn't a talking point. This was a provocation. Candace had turned grief into leverage, and she wielded it like a weapon. Then she turned, slowly, almost ceremoniously, toward Jasmine Crockett. The motion was simple, but the intent behind it was razor sharp. It wasn't a glance. It was a challenge. Her eyes locked on Jasmine's with clinical precision, as if placing her on the witness stand for the world to judge. "And you, Ms. Crockett," she continued, her tone sliding from attack to accusation, "you are their perfect weapon, a lawyer trained to turn resentment into litigation, a mouthpiece wrapped in credentials, legitimizing hate with a smile." The words didn't just sting, they sliced. They reframed everything Jasmine had ever stood for, civil rights, legal reform, generational healing, as something toxic, manipulative, transactional. The crowd responded like a pressure cooker cracking open. A sharp whistle cut the air from the far left side of the room. Murmurs rose from the middle rows, and from the right flank, supporters of Owens, came the sound of slow, mocking applause. Not all clapped out of agreement. Some did it for the spectacle. Others clapped because they believed the blow had landed. But the center, the journalists, the fence-sitters, the young first-time voters, sat in stillness, like jurors at a trial they never signed up for. Candace had done more than argue a point. She had indicted Jasmine in front of millions, not for a policy, for her existence as a woman of color and power, as someone who used the law not to preserve the status quo, but to question it. And yet, Jasmine didn't move. She didn't fidget. She didn't blink. She had heard this tone before. In law school lecture halls when professors praised her analysis but questioned her attitude. In job interviews when white men twice her age asked if she could be a bit more moderate. On the floor of Congress when her voice cracked not from nerves but from the weight of holding in everything she could say but chose not to. This wasn't new, but it still burned. Because this time it wasn't subtle. This time it came from someone who looked like her, who wore the same skin but served a different master. So Jasmine rose, not physically, but in posture, in breath, in presence. It was like watching someone lift 100 years of ancestral memory onto their shoulders and still manage to stand straight. Her eyes, lit from beneath by something older than anger, fixed on Owens. And then, in a voice low and level, she answered. "You want to talk about Tool?" she said. "You're using the same script they used on my grandmother when she was told to sit in the back. Same words, same venom, just wrapped in better lighting." She paused, but not to hesitate. She paused because she wanted the audience to hear the silence that followed. She wanted them to feel the weight of history between each word. Then she added more slowly, more cuttingly, with the gravity of someone calling out not just a lie, but a betrayal. "You are trying to divide us with the very words they once used to divide our ancestors." That line didn't just shift the room, it reset it. A few gasps broke through the quiet like cracks in concrete. Cameras zoomed in with breathless instinct. In the production booth, someone whispered, "Clip that now," without realizing they'd said it aloud. Because this wasn't just a clapback. This wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a reckoning. Jasmine wasn't just speaking as herself. She was speaking for someone, for many, for the people who never got to stand on that stage, who had been pushed down by the same rhetoric Owens had just resurrected. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The force of what she said was not in volume. It was in truth. And as the crowd sat frozen between awe and outrage, one thing became crystal clear. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just here to win an argument. She was here to remind the world what justice sounds like when it refuses to whisper. The room was still echoing with Jasmine's defiant words when Candace adjusted her mic, eyes narrowed, not backing down but digging in, aiming not for the heart this time, but the spine. Candace Owens leaned into the moment like someone who had been waiting to flip the script, not just on her opponent, but on the entire narrative. Her fingers tapped the edge of the podium once, twice before she spoke again. This time not with fire, but with the controlled rhythm of someone building a case. "Let's talk numbers," she said, her voice slicing through the charged silence. 75% of black children born out of wedlock, black-on-black crime rates through the roof, neighborhoods ruled by violence, not opportunity. She didn't blink, didn't acknowledge the gasp from the crowd or the tension twisting in the back rows. Her words weren't meant to educate, they were meant to convict. The figures weren't there to illuminate systemic failure. They were presented like evidence of moral collapse. And then she turned the accusation outward. "And what do the so-called civil rights leaders do? They teach our people to blame, to protest, to expect handouts instead of demanding standards." The words didn't just echo, they landed. Hard. Her voice grew colder as she tightened the knife. "They use skin color as a shield. I used mine to walk out of the darkness." Gasps, boos, scattered applause. The room fractured all at once like glass under pressure. Someone in the back shouted, "Shame!" while another yelled, "Speak the truth!" And between them sat thousands frozen in stunned disbelief, unsure if they were watching political commentary or the unmaking of a movement. The moderator visibly tensed, his hand gripping the microphone like a lifeline. Cameras swiveled back and forth in frantic choreography. And Candace, unshaken, stood tall in the chaos. To her, this wasn't backlash. It was confirmation. The more volatile the response, the more she believed she had hit the nerve. But what made her words so dangerous wasn't just the content, it was the context. She wasn't arguing policy. She was reshaping pain into a personal brand, weaponizing resilience to deny collective struggle. She painted herself as proof that hardship was optional, that poverty was a choice, and that those still trapped were there by their own design, or worse, because people like Jasmine Crockett had convinced them they belonged there. And by drawing that line, Candace wasn't just disagreeing, she was erasing history, erasing systems, erasing the lived realities of millions who had fought not for pity, but for recognition. She didn't raise her voice, but something in Jasmine's tone shifted. It thickened, grounded in lived pain and righteous fury. Numbers don't reveal truth, she began, her voice controlled but vibrating with purpose. They reflect conditions. They don't explain why communities are bleeding or why families are fractured. They don't tell you about redlining or schools crumbling from neglect or entire generations locked out of wealth before they could even spell their own names. She took a step closer to the mic, gaze locked on Candace like a laser cutting through fog. But you, she said steady and sharp, you use those numbers like digital shackles, not to expose injustice, but to silence the very people who've lived in real chains. The audience froze, the cameras zoomed in, and time itself seemed to narrow. You want people to believe data is destiny, she continued, but I'm standing here as living proof that it's not. That pain doesn't mean pathology. That survival is not shame. Her voice didn't shake. It carved, each word a strike against the false certainty that statistics can explain away systemic cruelty. And as Jasmine stood there, her expression firm but not hardened, she didn't just refute Candace. She redefined the battlefield. No longer was this about who had the slicker argument or louder applause. This was about who was willing to speak from the wound instead of just pointing at it. And in that moment, Jasmine wasn't a politician. She was the sum of every story that had been erased, every voice drowned out by pie charts and partisan spin. Her words hung in the air like verdicts, and no one could claim not to have heard them. Just as Jasmine's final words settled like a thunderclap over the crowd, a sudden flicker on the auxiliary screen to stage right shattered the rhythm and changed everything. Without warning, the massive screen lit up, hijacking the air in the room as easily as it hijacked every gaze. The moderator froze mid-glance, earpiece buzzing as producers scrambled behind the scenes. Then came the unmistakable image. Candace Owens, standing at a podium in 2018, delivering a speech at a European youth summit. The footage was raw, the lighting harsh, but her voice was clear, painfully so. She wore the same confident composure, the same certainty in her tone, as if she were speaking an uncomfortable truth the world needed to hear. If Hitler just wanted to make Germany great and have things run well, okay, fine. The words weren't shouted. They weren't accidental. They rolled out with chilling calm, coded in a logic that felt surgically detached. And then came the silence, not from the video, but from the room. A collective freeze like the entire audience had been shoved off balance without warning. Gasps erupted, first in ripples, then in waves. A woman in the third row leapt from her seat, face red, hands trembling as she yelled, "She said what?" Murmurs boiled into outrage. The clip continued, Candace discussing nationalism, sovereignty, historical nuance, phrases that might have passed in a think tank, but here, amid a debate about racial justice, they hit like betrayal. Another voice roared from the back balcony, raw with disbelief. Whose side is she even on? The auditorium cracked under the pressure. Some people stood, others sat rigid, their faces pale or contorted. The journalists in the front row didn't even blink. They typed like machines, eyes wide, as if afraid to miss even a second of the unfolding fallout. The flashes started next, dozens of them. Journalists and bystanders capturing a collapse in real time. Each burst of light was a sentence, each click a witness statement. Candace Owens, who had stood so assuredly moments earlier, now stared at the screen with an expression that began as defiance but slowly unraveled into disbelief. Her hands, once clenched in control, had opened slightly, fingers twitching as if searching for something to grip. She wasn't watching a political opponent's tactic. She was watching her own past surface like a ghost she thought had been buried. Meanwhile, Jasmine didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't flinch. Her stillness said more than any counter-argument ever could. She had no need to gloat, because this moment wasn't hers to exploit. It belonged to the truth, to the history Candace had tried to rewrite, repurpose, or erase. The screen didn't just show a video. It showed a fracture, a moment of unmasking. And in that flicker of time, when the arena swirled with disbelief and outrage, Candace Owens, the woman who had accused others of hiding behind their skin, was now face to face with something she couldn't outrun: her own words, her own image, her own record. And the question hanging in the air, raw, damning, inescapable, wasn't just, what did she mean, but who is she really fighting for? Security shifted along the walls, sensing the energy shift from debate to instability. The moderator lowered his cards and glanced nervously at the crew off stage. The debate had reached its breaking point, and the crowd, no longer just an audience, had become a jury. While the crowd reeled from the footage, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed, Jasmine didn't hesitate. She stepped forward into the silence like someone who had been waiting her whole life for this exact moment. Her heels didn't echo. They struck. Each step was measured, not out of hesitation, but control. Her face carried none of the smugness seen too often in political theater. No gloating. No raised fist. Just the quiet, devastating calm of a woman who had carried too much truth for too long, and now had an open microphone and a country watching. The air was still thick with the aftershock of the Hitler clip, but Jasmine cut through it like a scalpel, standing tall, voice low and deliberate. "You say I'm the one dividing our people?" she asked, her words neither rushed nor theatrical. They were steady, forged in courtroom steel and childhood fire. "You say our movement is just theater?" She wasn't asking. She was laying foundation, each line a brick dropped with purpose. Then her voice narrowed into something sharper, an indictment wrapped in ancestral memory. "Then what exactly are you doing with human history, rehearsing the most dangerous play ever written?" The audience didn't gasp. They didn't cheer. They just stilled. The kind of silence that doesn't come from awe, but from impact. Her words didn't need punctuation. They were the punctuation. Around the stage, even the camera operators hesitated, afraid that moving might disrupt the current of something sacred. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't merely responding to an opponent. She was answering to ghosts, to the unnamed millions who had no podium, no spotlight, no retake. Her voice carried not just argument, but weight, of grief, of betrayal, of generations used as statistics and forgotten in policy. And that line, rehearsing the most dangerous play ever written, didn't just challenge Candace. It dragged into the light every sanitized narrative, every false neutral, every attempt to reframe oppression as order. Jasmine stood still after delivering the blow, but everything around her moved. The crowd shifted, the room's energy tilted, the air itself seemed to lean in. And across from her, Candace Owens, who had come into the arena commanding the tempo, now looked like a woman trying to breathe through a storm she didn't see coming. Because for all the data and deflection, for all the cold composure she'd worn like armor, there was no metric for what had just happened. Truth, spoken plainly, had just leveled the stage. The sting of Jasmine's words still hung in the air like smoke from a fresh explosion, and for the first time all night, Candace Owens didn't have a response locked and loaded. Just silence, brief but telling. She stood at the podium, shoulders slightly back, chin lifted, but something essential in her posture had faltered. Her jaw clenched as her gaze flicked from the crowd to the giant screen where her own past had just been played in front of a nation. She tried to swallow the tremor rising in her throat, but it clung there, stubborn and exposed. The moment was slipping, not because her opponent had outshouted her, but because the truth had outlasted her. What she had built in years of commanding sound bites and viral certainty now felt fragile, like a glass tower rattling from its own echo. Her eyes narrowed with urgency. She leaned into the microphone and began to speak, not with the sharp calm she'd used earlier in the night, but with something tighter, more brittle. "I do not support Hitler," she snapped, emphasizing each syllable like they were barricades meant to hold back a flood. That clip was edited, taken out of context. I was speaking about national sovereignty, not justification of evil. But her words didn't land. They lingered, suspended in a room that had already decided it wasn't buying the warranty. Her tone, once measured, now felt like a scramble. It was the sound of someone who could feel the spotlight turning harsh, not warm. Someone who realized too late that a carefully groomed image cannot survive when the frame is shattered. The audience didn't boo, didn't cheer. They stared. The silence that followed wasn't grace. It was judgment. And somewhere, deep behind the defensive rhythm of her voice, Candace seemed to understand that no amount of spin could rewrite the footage the world had just seen. Not in this room. Not tonight. Across the stage, Jasmine Crockett stood motionless, but radiating a presence so full, so unshakable, it was as if the center of gravity had shifted toward her. She didn't blink, didn't tilt her head. She waited for Candace to finish, not because she respected her answer, but because she wanted the country to hear it completely without interruption, so it could fully weigh the hollowness inside it. And when the final word was spoken, Jasmine stepped forward. No performance, no theatrical breath, just calm, steady, devastating. "You didn't just speak," she said, her voice low but ringing with moral finality. "You spread poison and called it freedom." The room locked around her words like iron gates sealing shut. They weren't accusations, they were verdicts. And Jasmine delivered them not as a politician, not even as an opponent, but as someone who had seen too much truth corrupted in her lifetime to let this moment pass without clarity. Her words cut deeper, not because they were loud, but because they were precise. Candace had spent years branding herself as fearless, as unfiltered, as someone brave enough to say what others wouldn't. But now Jasmine had said something Candace couldn't answer, not without indicting herself further. And as that truth settled into every corner of the auditorium, Candace's armor, polished and rehearsed, no longer gleamed. It cracked. Jasmine didn't follow up with more words. She didn't need to. What she had said wasn't part of a debate strategy. It was something older, heavier, truth carved from the bones of experience, laid bare in front of a crowd that had been told too many stories, for too long, by people who didn't bleed when history repeated itself. In that moment, no one was counting points. They were counting truths. And Jasmine had just spoken one that couldn't be debated. It could only be remembered. As Jasmine's final words settled like a gavel over the room, the impact began to ripple outward, not just through the crowd, but across the nation's media infrastructure, like sirens sounding at the edge of a political earthquake. The moment the debate ended, it didn't end at all. It detonated. Studio lights faded, but America was just starting to lean in. Control rooms across the country were alive with the staccato rhythm of urgency, editors barking into headsets, anchors flipping through last-minute cue cards, producers slicing clips into viral ammunition. In the space of 30 minutes, Jasmine Crockett's final strike had become a movement, and Candace Owens, once untouchable, was in freefall. On CNN's homepage, a breaking headline surged across the screen in bold red. "Candace Owens, from conservative icon to national outrage." Not speculation, not satire, a verdict. Within the hour, MSNBC responded with their own indictment. "Owens implodes Live, Civil Rights Summit turns into reckoning." The phrasing wasn't just harsh, it was final. And as if timed to perfection, the New York Times dropped its own hammer. An editorial read across boardrooms and barbershops alike. "When Candace Owens became the story she thought she controlled." Screens across the country flickered with looped footage of the implosion. The split screen was unavoidable. On one side, Candace's face frozen in mid-denial. On the other, Jasmine Crockett's unwavering stare. Candace's voice echoed in endless repetition. "I do not support Hitler." And then, seconds later, Jasmine's reply, calm, devastating, was carved into headlines and quoted on every channel. "You spread poison and called it freedom." There was no spin left that could bury it. The nation wasn't watching a debate anymore. They were watching a collapse. And this time, no editing room, no PR statement, no emergency podcast could outrun the momentum. But the most devastating blow didn't come from a commentator or a viral tweet. It came from a man in a gray suit with no camera pointed at him. A journalist who had once sat in Candace's green rooms, who had shaken her hand at donor events, who had kept quiet long enough. That changed. An investigative reporter known for his precision and cold-blooded accuracy released a document that shattered the last defense she might have clung to. An internal memo from Turning Point USA, dated nearly 2 years prior. It wasn't bombastic. It didn't need to be. Its simplicity was its weapon. The memo stated that Candace Owens had been formally reprimanded for exceeding the acceptable boundaries of political expression, particularly with regard to statements that appear to rationalize or diminish the severity of extremist ideology. The language was direct, corporate, legal, but its meaning was unmistakable. They had known. Any further rhetorical volatility, the memo warned, would result in termination of her contract. There was no way to spin that, not even for Candace. The document tore through social media like a wildfire on gasoline. Screenshots spread faster than press releases. Political talk shows rearranged their segments to cover it. Primetime anchors held it up to the camera like a bloodied glove at a crime scene. On air, you could hear their tone shift, from critique to certainty, from discomfort to condemnation. Candace Owens wasn't just being challenged, she was being disavowed. Right-wing influencers who had built careers defending her suddenly posted cryptic breaks in direction. Conservative donors who had once funded her speaking tours fell silent. Podcasts pulled episodes. Bookstores postponed launch events. Her public calendar vanished overnight. One think tank quietly removed her from its advisory board. The institutions that had once celebrated her contrarianism were now shrinking from the radioactive heat of her own record. And not because they were surprised, but because they had finally been cornered by her reflection and no longer had the stomach to defend it. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett never said another word. She didn't need to. Her silence carried more weight than an entire press cycle, because she had never raised her voice. She hadn't smeared, accused, or dramatized. She had listened, and then she had told the truth. She didn't drag Candace Owens down. She simply stood tall enough to cast a light, and in that light, the shadow revealed itself for what it was: loud, calculated, and finally undone by its own echo. As Candace Owens's empire cracked beneath the weight of her own rhetoric, another voice, steady, principled, and long overlooked, began to rise from the silence and reclaim the spotlight. It started with a tweet, just one, a clip no longer than 2 minutes, buried in an old C-SPAN feed, posted without context. Jasmine Crockett standing outside a courthouse in Dallas, flanked not by staffers or security, but by grieving parents and frightened community members. Her hair pulled back, her blazer dusted with pollen and protest. She held a mic in one hand and a file of legal documents in the other. No teleprompter, no media team. Her voice cracked not from weakness, but from holding in too much for too long. Justice doesn't wait for the headlines, she said, eyes locked on the cameras like they were accountable too. It waits for someone to stop being afraid of losing everything. The clip began to circulate slowly at first, shared by legal activists, former clients, small civil rights organizations that remembered the case in the name. Then a prominent author reposted it, calling her a voice that never needed a stage to speak the truth. Within 4 hours, it was trending globally. Jasmine Crockett rose to the top of Twitter. On YouTube, the video skyrocketed to #1 in the United States with titles like "The Real Leader We Ignored" and "This Woman Should Have Been President Already." Comment sections filled with stories, teachers in rural towns saying they showed the clip to students, mothers writing, "Thank you for speaking like you've actually lived it." Veterans, lawyers, janitors, teenagers, all flooding the feed with something almost extinct in political discourse: belief. It wasn't just the words that resonated, it was the posture, the history. Jasmine wasn't selling herself in that clip. She wasn't making an argument. She was standing in the gap. The boy she was defending, 14 years old, wrongfully accused of stealing his own bike, tackled to the ground by police, wasn't a headline. He was beside her, trembling, staring at her as if she were the last unshaken hand in a world collapsing around him. She had taken that stand when no cameras were on her, when no network promised airtime, when speaking meant risking votes, donors, safety. It wasn't politics, it was character. Now, in the aftermath of Candace's televised collapse, the clip returned like a prophecy fulfilled. The country was already searching for something to hold on to, something that felt real. And there she was, in low resolution, with no makeup team, offering not just sound bites but a standard. Jasmine hadn't tried to go viral, but her truth had waited patiently for the noise to burn out. And once it did, her voice rang louder than ever. The media noticed. Overnight, the contrast became a national talking point. CNN aired a segment titled Two Faces of the Fight, Performance versus Purpose. The segment played Jasmine's courthouse clip side by side with Candace's now infamous 2018 footage, then cut back to Jasmine's line from the summit that shattered the debate. You spread poison and called it freedom. The anchor didn't even need to editorialize. The split screen said everything. SNBC followed suit with a primetime panel discussion where three political strategists, all from different parties, agreed on a single point. America had underestimated Jasmine Crockett. One analyst called her the slow flame we should have been watching. Another simply said, we forgot what authenticity looked like until she reminded us. Meanwhile, The Atlantic published a piece titled The Power of Not Playing the Game, chronicling how Jasmine's refusal to match Candace's theatrics had, ironically, made her the most trusted voice on that stage. She had shown the country that conviction didn't need volume. It needed clarity. The ripple extended far beyond media. School boards across the country requested permission to use Jasmine's clip in civic education classes. A New Jersey principal said in a viral interview, kids need to see leadership that isn't built on tearing people down. Law professors added her name to syllabi. Churches replayed her courthouse speech during Sunday services. TikTok creators stitched her debate moment with clips of Black women in history, from Fannie Lou Hamer to Angela Davis, captioning the series, "We don't yell to be heard, we speak to be remembered." What made it even more extraordinary was the juxtaposition. Two Black women, both bold, both brilliant, both unafraid of the spotlight, but only one had used that spotlight to illuminate something beyond herself. Candace had commanded attention for years. She had weaponized outrage into opportunity and turned provocation into brand. Jasmine, on the other hand, had waited, not passively, but intentionally. She had fought court case after court case, defended the invisible, walked into rooms that didn't want her, and spoke anyway. She hadn't gone viral until the world was finally quiet enough to hear what she'd been saying all along. Now the nation was listening. Jasmine and Candace became symbols overnight, not just of ideology, but of integrity. One had built her brand on provocation, the other on persistence. One stood behind performance, the other behind principle. And though both faces now appeared across every channel and feed, only one of them was met with applause, not apology. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won a debate, she had reclaimed a narrative. One too often drowned by punditry, blurred by false equivalence, or erased by selective memory. She didn't tear down Candace Owens. She didn't have to. Candace's own record did that. What Jasmine did was remind America what it looked like when someone chose to stand for something, even when no one was looking. And when the spotlight finally came, she didn't flinch. She didn't exploit it. She used it like a mirror, showing the country not just who she was, but who we could be if we chose courage over performance. In the days that followed, Candace's team released carefully worded statements citing misrepresentation, media bias, and a coordinated smear campaign. But it didn't matter. The crowd had moved on. The microphones had turned. The applause had found a new home. Because Jasmine hadn't just stepped onto a stage that night, she claimed it. Not for herself, but for the voices like hers that had been shouted over for too long. And for once, the country didn't just watch, it believed her. As Jasmine's rise captured hearts across the country, Candace Owens wasn't just losing control of the narrative. She was watching the ground beneath her ideology crack wide open. And in desperation, She did what political operatives do when cornered. She called a press conference. The room was packed, bright lights, restless camera crews, familiar faces from every conservative media outlet, and rows of political loyalists who had once cheered Candace's rise. Now many of them sat quietly, fingers laced, eyes darting toward one another, not sure if they were attending a moment of redemption or witnessing a final gasp. Candace Owens stepped to the podium with the same polished composure she'd worn for years, but there was a slight hitch in her rhythm, a shadow behind her eyes. The headlines had not been kind. The backlash had been swift. And now she needed to hit back with something sharper than denial, a new enemy. This entire media frenzy, she began, her voice confident but tightened with urgency, isn't about accountability. It's about creating martyrs for the sake of emotional theater. She paused, letting the silence bend around her. Jasmine Crockett isn't a truth teller. She's a politician playing the victim card with Olympic precision. She doesn't seek justice. She manipulates it. She weaponizes public sympathy to build power, not change. Her words were sharp, almost rehearsed, but they rang with desperation, not strength. This wasn't a debate. It was a performance, a calculated ploy to ride a wave of outrage straight into political clout. Then came the final thrust, delivered with the coldness of someone who believed the wound would be fatal. Jasmine is using emotion the way con artists use mirrors, to distract from the facts and rewrite the truth. The room didn't erupt. It didn't clap. It waited. The journalists in the back scribbled furiously, not because the words shocked them, but because they recognized the scent of panic wrapped in defiance. It was the language of someone trying to set fire to the evidence while the cameras were still rolling. Within minutes, clips from the press conference went live. Owens's quote, "Politician playing the victim card," flashed across every major news ticker, captioned with dramatic backgrounds and split-screen commentary. Fox News leaned in. The Daily Caller tried to frame it as Candace regaining control. But the pulse of the public had changed. This wasn't 2020, and Jasmine wasn't someone they could spin into a stereotype. Within hours, Jasmine Crockett responded, not with a counter rally, not with an attack ad, but live on national television. She sat calmly under studio lights, wearing no armor but clarity, no handlers behind her. Just a microphone and the steady breath of someone who had spent her entire life being told to sit down and had decided never again. The interviewer asked the question delicately, as if it were dynamite. "Congresswoman Crockett, Candace Owens accused you of using victimhood and emotion to gain political power. How do you respond?" Jasmine's answer came without pause, without venom, but with a tone so grounded it left no room for distortion. "I don't seek power," she said, her voice calm but rising like a tide. "I'm restoring voice to the people who've been silenced by her half-truths and polished cruelty. I don't need to manufacture outrage. I've lived in the reality her narrative denies." The studio fell silent. There were no edits, no cutaways, just her face, firm, focused, and raw. Emotion isn't weakness. It's memory. It's lived experience. And if she's afraid of that, maybe it's because deep down, she knows the facts aren't on her side. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. She just let the truth rest on the table like a verdict. "I don't seek power. I'm giving back the voice her half-truths pushed into silence." The clip hit like a hammer. It spread faster than anything Candace had said at her podium. Viewers across demographics, young, old, urban, rural, progressive, and moderate, began reposting it not as content, but as confirmation. Jasmine hadn't just refuted Candace. She had unmasked the cruelty behind the narrative Owens had sold for years. That acknowledging systemic harm was somehow weakness, that speaking about injustice was somehow manipulation. Jasmine flipped the entire script without shouting a single word. And that silence, poised, confident, morally unshakable, became her weapon. The public reaction came in waves. Influencers, pastors, teachers, and military veterans voiced their support. One commentator wrote, "Jasmine Crockett didn't play the victim. She became the shield." Another added, "This is what leadership looks like when it remembers the people, not the camera." But the real fracture happened inside the one space Candace believed she still owned: the conservative Black community. Within 48 hours of her press conference, prominent Black conservatives began issuing careful, uneasy statements, some distancing themselves, others demanding she step back to reflect. But not all were gentle. The New Black Federalist Alliance, a group that once featured Owens on their homepage, released a blistering call for her to resign from public political advocacy. Ms. Owens has not only failed to represent our values, the statement read, she has weaponized white-adjacent ideology against the very communities she claims to uplift. Other groups followed. Grassroots organizers who had once cited her speeches began scrubbing her name from their archives. A leaked email from a Black conservative donor summit revealed internal pressure to cancel her speaking slot entirely. The message was clear. She had crossed a line even her allies could no longer justify. The split was total. Even her most loyal defenders were no longer united. A conservative podcast host, once one of her loudest supporters, opened his show with an audible sigh. I defended Candace because I believe she challenged the system, he said, but I'm starting to think she just wanted to burn it down. Meanwhile, Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't spike the football. She didn't launch a campaign. She kept working, visiting constituents, pushing legislation, speaking at underfunded schools, and walking into courtrooms most pundits wouldn't dare step into without makeup and handlers. She didn't need to say anything else, because by now the contrast said everything. Candace had brought microphones. Jasmine had brought mirrors. Candace had provoked. Jasmine had revealed. And the nation had made its choice, not based on who shouted loudest, but on who spoke last with the most truth. The damage wasn't just reputational, it was structural. And as the moral weight of Jasmine's words echoed across the country, Candace Owens didn't just lose the debate. She began losing everything else. The unraveling didn't come with sirens or public arrests. It came in emails marked confidential, in unreturned phone calls, in meeting invites silently revoked. Within 72 hours of the broadcast, the corporate silence that had once protected Candace Owens began to fracture like thin ice under pressure. First to go were the speaking engagements. 4 major conservative conferences pulled her from their upcoming lineups without public explanation. Then came the sponsors. A major tech startup that had partnered with her media platform released a curt, sanitized press release. We remain committed to respectful discourse and the values of inclusion. Another corporation followed, this one more direct. We do not tolerate any messaging that appears to excuse authoritarianism, past or present. By the end of the week, her email inbox was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. But the blow that struck deepest came not from tech firms or talk shows. It came from the publishing house that had once promised her legacy in hardcover. The book was scheduled to launch in 3 months. The marketing campaign was ready. The cover had been printed. Ads purchased. Pre-orders open. The title? Unfiltered, The Voice America Tried to Silence. Ironic in retrospect, because now that title had become prophecy and not in the way Candace had intended. Her publisher called a private meeting with executives, lawyers, and crisis PR. Less than 30 minutes later, she received a terse email. Due to unforeseen reputational risks and significant backlash tied to recent public events, we are suspending publication indefinitely. There was no phone call, no personal apology, just cold, final clarity. Outside her window, the world moved on. Jasmine Crockett's courthouse clip had been replayed 1,000 more times. Her approval numbers rose. Panels discussed whether she would run for Senate. Candace watched it all in silence, face blank, back straight, but inside something was collapsing. Not her beliefs, not her defiance, but the illusion that she could say anything, at any cost, and always walk away untouched. That illusion had carried her for years, but now it lay in shards beneath her. So she did what anyone does when the lights are still on, but the audience is gone. She opened Twitter. She didn't tag anyone. No hashtags. Just a single line, typed at 2:17 a.m. I haven't changed my views. America just can't handle the truth anymore. It sat there for 4 minutes, then 13, then an hour. Retweets came. Then replies, thousands of them. some furious, some mournful, some accusing her of cowardice, others calling her a martyr. But the most common word repeated over and over was disappointed. Not angry, not shocked, disappointed. A word more lethal than outrage. A word that signaled not a battle, but a verdict. By sunrise, her account was locked. Officially, it was unclear whether she had deactivated it herself or if it had been quietly restricted under the platform's misinformation policy. But it didn't matter, because when her name stopped trending, something else took its place. Jasmine Crockett's quote, framed in bold white text on a black background, now circulating like a quiet rebellion. I don't seek power. I'm giving back the voice her half-truths pushed into silence. The juxtaposition was unmissable. One woman had vanished behind a keyboard. The other had stepped into the street, into schools, into the national psyche. Candace's final tweet became a digital tombstone. Cold, defiant, alone. No follow-up, no clarification. Just one last sentence echoing into a timeline that had already moved on. Her supporters tried to revive it. They posted photos, compilations, rants. But the tide was no longer theirs to command. Her voice, once amplified by the friction of controversy, now faded in the static of self-inflicted irrelevance. Cable news stopped mentioning her name. Advertisers reallocated budgets. Her podcast lost half its syndication. People didn't need to cancel Candace Owens. She had canceled herself. And Jasmine, she didn't mention Candace again. Not once. Because she didn't need to. Her silence was not avoidance. It was victory. She wasn't building momentum from destruction. She was planting something deeper, in classrooms, in courtrooms, in hearts. Her words weren't trending anymore because they were being taught, not debated, lived. And in this new silence, the contrast became final. Candace Owens had spoken for years and been heard. Jasmine Crockett had spoken once and been believed. With her critics silenced and the nation watching not out of curiosity, but out of conviction, Jasmine Crockett stepped onto a new kind of stage, not to respond, but to remind the country why she never needed to raise her voice to be heard. The ballroom of the NAACP National Convention wasn't just packed, it was brimming with electricity, the kind that doesn't come from lights or sound systems, but from history surging beneath the floorboards. It was the final night of the summit in Detroit, and every seat in the Grand River Auditorium had been filled 2 hours before the program began. Not just delegates, not just press, but people, students in borrowed suits, elders in church hats, organizers in worn sneakers, each of them buzzing with the same question. Would she say anything about Candace? Jasmine Crockett hadn't spoken publicly since her now viral line on national television. I don't seek power. I'm giving back the voice her half-truths pushed into silence. She hadn't posted. She hadn't toured. She hadn't responded to the avalanche of think pieces, endorsements, or speculation. And that silence had only added to the tension. But when she finally walked out onto the stage that night, she didn't carry that tension. She dismantled it. She stepped behind the podium without fanfare, wearing a simple black suit and no jewelry except the gold pin of the Congressional Shield. Her heels clicked once, then settled. No anthem played. No voiceover announced her name. And yet, when she looked out across the thousands in attendance, it was like the room took a single, unified breath, then waited. The moderator had barely finished saying, "Please welcome Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett," before the applause began. But Jasmine didn't smile. Not yet. She let the cheers swell and fade like a wave returning to shore. Then she leaned forward into the mic and began. I want to thank the NAACP, she said, her voice low but clear. Not just for the invitation, but for the timing. Because right now we're watching the country pretend it's shocked to discover what so many of us already knew. The crowd stirred. Phones lifted. Cameras clicked. We're not shocked that a system rewards cruelty. We're not shocked that someone can build a platform on division and wear it like a badge. And we're certainly not shocked that when truth walks into the room, lies start tripping over their own microphones. A ripple of laughter moved through the room, followed by murmurs of affirmation. But Jasmine didn't ride the energy. She redirected it. I didn't come here to clap back, she continued. I came here to call forward. Because what we've been witnessing these past few weeks isn't about two women with opposing views. It's about a country finally asking itself, who do we trust with the microphone when the noise dies down? And then, after a pause that stretched just long enough to still every breath in the hall, she delivered the line that would ricochet through newsrooms, classrooms, and living rooms for weeks. It's not about who shouts the loudest. Sometimes being real is loud enough. The crowd erupted, not like a rally, like a courtroom hearing a long-awaited verdict. Applause thundered beneath the chandeliers. One man shouted, "Yes, ma'am," from the back, while a group of students near the front raised their fists in silent salute. Journalists began texting producers mid-sentence. "Clip this now." It wasn't just a quote. It was a message, etched, unforgettable, undeniably earned. But Jasmine wasn't done. Her tone sharpened, not in anger, but in intention. They say we're emotional, as if being outraged by injustice is some kind of weakness, as if having empathy disqualifies you from having power. But let me be very clear. If emotion is the result of living through redlining, police violence, underfunded schools, stolen wages, and stolen history, then I pray we never go numb. The room roared again, but this time it wasn't celebration, it was recognition. The way Black audiences know the difference between performance and prophecy. Jasmine had never needed to shout to be heard. She spoke with a cadence that came not from practice, but from having survived the very structures she was now helping to dismantle. Let them call us too sensitive. Let them say we're too angry, too loud, too proud, she said, because what they're really saying is that they're too comfortable, too used to the silence, too dependent on the myth that we will stay quiet out of fear of being called divisive. Here she paused, not to breathe, but to let them catch up. I'm not interested in being palatable. I'm interested in being real. And if the truth makes people uncomfortable, they should ask themselves why comfort ever required someone else's silence in the first place. The entire auditorium stood up. It wasn't staged. It wasn't a cue. It was instinct. An elder in the front row wiped her eyes. A teenage girl held her phone over her head, whispering, "She's saying it for us." On Twitter, clips were already being uploaded mid-sentence. Hashtags formed before the speech was even done. Loud enough. Shushers realize enough. Crockett 2026. But Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She brought the room to its feet by doing exactly what Candace never could. Speaking without performing. Not to be the star of the moment, but to honor the struggle that had made that moment possible. She closed with a simple nod, stepped back from the mic, and let the applause wash over her. Not like a wave crashing, but like sunlight breaking through a storm that had overstayed its welcome. And just like that, Jasmine Crockett left the stage, not with the swagger of a victor, but with the stillness of someone who had just told the truth and was finally believed. Her voice still echoed from the MSP ballroom when the next invitation arrived. Not a TV booking, not another op-ed request, but something far larger, the main stage of the 2025 Democratic National Convention. There was no leak, no teaser trailer, just a press release stamped with the Democratic Party's official seal and a sentence that detonated across every major news outlet before noon. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to deliver the keynote address at DNC 2025. It was the kind of announcement that, just a year earlier, would have been dismissed as symbolic. A nod, a gesture, but not now. Now it felt like a reshuffling of gravity. The same woman who had been told she was too direct, too emotional, too unpolished for primetime politics had just been handed the microphone on the largest stage her party could offer. And no one doubted she'd earned it. The headlines that followed weren't diplomatic. They were seismic. Politico called it a generational turning point. The Washington Post labeled her a rising voice for the America that's tired of permission. But it was Rolling Stone that put it most bluntly. The Crockett earthquake has already begun. This convention is just the aftershock. Behind the scenes, the pressure was immense. Staffers debated whether she should wear a blazer or a dress. Should she read off a teleprompter or speak from memory? Should she reference the Candace Owens debacle, or let history speak for itself? Jasmine made the decision simple. I'll wear whatever I want. I'll say what needs to be said. And I'm not here to relive a takedown. I'm here to lift people up. When she stepped out onto that DNC stage in Chicago, the stadium erupted not like a political rally, but like something between a revival and a revolution. There were tears, cheers, a chorus of, "That's her! That's her!" echoing through the rafters. Delegates from across the country, rural counties, inner cities, college towns, stood with signs that didn't say Crockett 2025 or Madam President. They said, "I vote because of her." She began slowly, carefully. No theatrics, no music, no light show. Just Jasmine, alone beneath the spotlight, holding nothing but the room's full attention. When they invited me here, she said, I asked if they wanted the safe version of Jasmine Crockett or the real one. A pause, laughter, then silence. They said real, so here I am. From that first line, the nation knew it wasn't just a keynote. It was a reckoning in heels. She didn't just talk about democracy. She talked about fear, about waking up in a country that tells you you're lucky to be included in a system still rigged against you, about knowing that when you walk into a polling station, you carry not just your ID, but your ancestors. They say young people don't care, she told the crowd, but I've seen them cry in courtrooms and rise in protests. What they don't believe in isn't democracy. It's the people who keep asking them to vote like their voice matters and then act shocked when it actually does. It was raw. It was personal. It was exactly what the country hadn't known it needed. And the response wasn't polite applause. It was a flood. Thousands of letters poured in, emails, DMS hashtags, clips. But the most moving, handwritten notes, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, slid into the DNC mailroom from Black teenagers, young women, first-time voters. Notes that began with lines like, "You're the first person who made me believe this country could hear me. You're the reason I registered. You're the first politician who didn't sound like a politician." One letter, scrawled in black ink on loose-leaf paper, made its way to her desk before the convention even ended. It read, "You're not just my congresswoman. You're the first grown-up I've ever seen say something hard and not smile to make it easier for people who've never had to live it." Cable news couldn't keep up. Neither could party leadership. The headline on MSNBC's morning segment read, "Jasmine Crockett, the Michelle Obama of her generation?" And the phrase stuck, not just as praise but as prophecy. Commentators debated what it meant. Was it a comparison in style, substance, legacy? But in barbershops and bookstores, dorm rooms and backyards, people weren't asking what the label meant. They were asking what came next. She didn't announce a run for higher office. She didn't launch a PAC. She just kept showing up, on city corners, in union halls, in overcrowded schools, repeating a single line to anyone who asked what came next. "This isn't about me. This is about who gets to speak and who gets listened to." But the truth was inescapable. She had already shifted the landscape. Journalists began using a new phrase in print, the Crockett quake. It wasn't just a clever turn of phrase. It was the name given to a measurable change in political engagement among young Black voters in post-convention polling. In Georgia, youth registration spiked by 23% within a month of her speech. In Texas, where she first made her name, voter outreach groups reported the highest turnout for community-led town halls since 2008. On TikTok, her speech was remixed into beats, used in art, set to gospel choirs and hip-hop rhythms alike. One video captioned, "We don't vote for hope, we vote for her," hit 11 million views in 2 days. This was no longer a moment, it was a movement. And Jasmine Crockett, who had once been mocked for being too raw, too street, too much, had become something the country couldn't define fast enough to contain. Not a mascot, not a disruptor, but a new kind of mirror. A reminder that truth doesn't need a filter to change history. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it before it's popular. She had spoken that truth, and the country hadn't just listened, it had moved. The world had already shifted, but as Jasmine stepped into one final interview, no script, no filter, just her and the truth, it became clear she had one last thing left to say, and the nation wasn't ready for how quiet it would fall when she said it. The studio was dimly lit, sleek and modern, but not flashy. The kind of place designed for moments that wouldn't need music or graphics to resonate. Jasmine Crockett sat alone beneath a single ring of overhead light. No notes, no handlers. Just a glass of water on the table, and a camera operator adjusting his focus with the reverence of someone filming something sacred. Across from her sat the anchor, seasoned, composed, but even he knew this wasn't just another segment. This was the close of a chapter. The room, though quiet, pulsed with a silent awareness. What she said tonight would not be forgotten. She began with reflection on legacy, on fear, on what it means to outlive the things that once tried to erase you. I wasn't born to be a headline, she said. I was born into a family that couldn't afford to dream unless someone else dared to break the rules first. Her voice carried no arrogance, just the certainty of someone who had earned every word. They told me to smile more, to soften my voice, to be less direct. But I wasn't raised to be pleasant. I was raised to be present. And then, as the interviewer leaned in, asking about the legacy of her movement, of Candace Owens, of the Black political divide that had spilled across a nation, Jasmine did not blink. She looked into the camera and said the words that would live longer than the broadcast. When a Black person tells you to forget injustice, they're not uniting us. They're surrendering us. The sentence didn't echo. It settled, like dust on marble, like the final period in a courtroom confession. In control rooms across the country, producers looked up. Editors circled the timestamp. In schools and union halls and barbershops and college campuses, everywhere that pain had once been told to lower its voice, people sat straighter, leaned closer, whispered, "Did you hear what she just said?" It wasn't anger. It wasn't performance. It was a surgical truth, one that cut clean through the layers of post-racial lies and respectability politics. Because Jasmine hadn't just called out injustice, she had called out those who enabled it in exchange for power. Those who wore Black skin but worked for silence. And she did it without raising her voice. The camera didn't cut away. And somewhere, far from the lights, far from the applause, far from the movement that had roared past her like a wave she thought she could ride, Candace Owens sat alone in a dark room. The television cast a pale blue flicker across her face. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Her jaw was still, her eyes locked on the screen, unmoving. She watched herself being erased, not by force, but by contrast. Jasmine wasn't even talking about her directly. But the truth had a shape, and Candace could see her outline inside it. No one else was in the room. The glass of wine beside her had gone untouched. The phone on the table didn't ring. No messages came. Because when power collapses, it doesn't scream. It hollows. And in that hollow silence, the final truth was delivered. The interview faded to black, and the screen displayed one closing line. Not from the anchor, not from the network, but typed in bold white font against a field of quiet. When you sell the truth to be celebrated, it's the truth that will silence you forever. And with that, the story didn't end. It simply stopped needing to be told. As the final screen faded and the silence settled, what lingered wasn't applause or anger, but a question etched into the soul of everyone watching. What did we just witness, and what does it mean for us now? This wasn't just a political clash. It was a revelation about how truth survives when power pretends not to hear. Jasmine Crockett didn't win because she shouted louder. She won because she never stopped listening to the voices no one else had time for. The lesson wasn't about defeating an opponent, but about refusing to abandon the people who still carry scars they were told to hide. When justice is reduced to a brand and pain becomes a punchline, it takes courage not to perform, but to persist. The true cost of silence isn't lost elections, it's lost generations. And when someone like Jasmine dares to stand, not for attention, but for accountability, the world remembers what real leadership looks like. Not polished, not perfect, but present. This story is a warning to those who twist truth for applause, and a promise to those who live it without permission. In the end, the moral is clear. If you stand with the forgotten, you may be mocked. But if you stand for yourself alone, you will be forgotten. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.